if everybody's here that is expected, maybe I can just say a few things. It is really a great pleasure to be witnessing this. Thomas has been in the group. Maybe it's a year and a half, something maybe a slight bit longer. Of course, the last year has been a very strange year, and but it's really been a great pleasure. He's been very productive, even with COVID in the way, and joined this project that Martin and I are working on. And so he's done quite a few things, and they're with some detours, mostly due to COVID. Some of the things that we imagined he'd be doing on this project were not possible. Started doing some simulations. Those worked well. I think everything worked out really nicely. He worked wonderfully with the group members, and one of them, Aritra, is here. There's another one, Cameron, that he worked very closely with. That I don't know if it's fair to say that you drove him away, but he left a week ago.
Right.
He accepted a really nice job at a startup company. And no, definitely Thomas did not drive him away at all.
I was doing my
They
best to
had a
keep him
great
around.
relationship, and as Thomas seems to have had with everyone in the group, and that just seems to be part of who he is. And I think parents that are here definitely a part of that. Well, so many aspects. I'm very proud of them, and I'm sure you guys are as well. So looking forward to the defense, Thomas.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. And just apologies for the mask today. Our Wi-Fi at home gave out, and so I'm down on campus, but hopefully it won't be a problem because I'll be able to share the slides, and I think we'll be great nonetheless. Okay, so let's see. I'll share my screen and get it started. All right. Oops, let's actually go to the first slide. Okay, so can everybody see this okay?
Yeah, and Thomas, where are you actually? I hear like a cryo pump nearby or something.
Oh, that might actually be Aritra's.
Oh, that's Aritra's.
Yeah. Yeah, if you would, everybody go ahead and mute. And also, do I sound okay and you can see my slides?
Sounds good to me. Yep.
Okay, great.
Yep, sound is good.
All right, well, let's get started. So really excited to have you all here. Thank you all so much for joining me today. So I'll be presenting a little bit of my work for Dan, my advisor under the Dessau group. I'm Thomas Balcom, and today's talk's about vibration and stability of the hybrid cryostat mechanical filter and the nano squid on tip. So there's quite a bit of information in the title alone, but hopefully we'll be able to do a great job of unpacking what everything means. Okay, so first thing I'd like to do is just give everybody a little bit of context on what a squid on tip experiment looks like, what it is, and where we are on squid on tip. So the Dessau group is currently building a squid on tip experiment. The device itself relies on what's called, or a piece of technology that's called a squid magnetometer. And so this is the acronym here. It's a great acronym. It stands for superconducting quantum interference device. So squids are some of the most sensitive magnetometers currently in existence. And the unique thing about the squid on tip experiment was that this was the first experimental design to take the squid magnetometer and put it at the tip of a thin and small probe. So I've zoomed in here so you can see what that looks like. So this is an existing squid. This is not our squid. This is from Poggio Labs in Switzerland. But I thought this would be a good example to kind of give you a bit of context on what a squid looks like. So let's zoom in on the probe. This is what makes a squid a scanning probe microscope. The way that they make the probe tip is by using a machine that will heat and pull a quartz tube until it reaches a fixed diameter that they need. When it cools, it'll fracture And then they'll deposit superconductor using a thin film sputtering technique onto either side of the quartz pipette, which leaves you a superconductor. In this case, we're looking at aluminum on either side, which is separated by bare quartz. So if we zoom in on the actual tip, we'll see the squid magnetometer that lives at the tip here. So this is in the bottom right of this right-hand image is the squid loop. As you can see, there's two X's here. These represent what are called Josephson junctions. They can also be a weak link, or they can be either a insulator or they can be a weak link. So in our case, these are weak links in this image here, which are, as you can see, separated by superconducting leads. So the squid loop, the actual magnetometer, is this loop here of the tip of the probe. And we're looking at an image on the order of about 200 nanometers. Ours and proposed designs are going to go down to maybe 50 nanometers or so. So a brief word on the way that the squid itself works and why it's so sensitive. There's a couple unique phenomenon and a clever design that go into making this work. In a word or two, in an applied magnetic field, the maximum current that can, or maximum critical current that can get through a squid loop is periodic in the flux inside the loop. And that's directly related to the quantum interference effects in the Josephson junctions. All right, so now we have a bit of context on the background of the squid and the experiment itself. Let's see, I'd like to talk about where I come into the experiment and what I'm doing as part of the Dessau group. So I do vibration isolation. So as a squid magnetometer, we're gonna need stability and a lot of the one of the key metrics of success in scanning probe microscopy and the squid on tip in particular is the stability of the tip relative to the surface of a sample. So that involves some vibration isolation techniques. So a brief outline on what is in the remainder of my talk. First, we'll talk about some of the sources of noise. So some of the things we're looking at that will affect the tip sample stability. That'll help us motivate vibration isolation. We'll take a little bit of a detour and talk about some of the scientific and technical background, like the LC circuit. We'll use that as a building block for the current force analogy and a bit of modeling. Finally, we'll look at the heart of my work, which is the hybrid cryostat filter. That involves a simulation software called COMSOL Multiphysics. We'll take a look at the experiments that I've run and built, some of the results I've gotten, and then finally we'll take it to reality and look at the vibration sensor and see how a mock-up filter performs against our simulations. All right, so first thing is the sources of noise. There are a couple obvious ones, like building noise, room noise, people walking around the lab. In general, you want to have a quiet laboratory environment. Another feature is that squids are cold. So we're going to need to refrigerate our experiment. And some of our experiments are going to require temperatures down to the level of about 1 Kelvin. There are a couple ways you can cool these kinds of experiments. There's a wet system. There's also what's known as a dry system. Wet systems use liquid cryogens like liquid helium or nitrogen. In our case, we've chosen to use a pulse tube cryocooler. So up in the top right image, this is what a pulse tube cold head looks like. And so there are a couple advantages with pulse tubes. Pulse tubes are known to be reliable and efficient. They can also keep the experiment cold for longer as compared to a wet system. There is one disadvantage, and that's one of the concerns of my work, which is the noise that a pulse tube will introduce by its function. Inside this head, helium gas will expand, absorb some heat, but also create a little bit of noise. And that exists from what we've seen at about a 1.4 hertz frequency. And since it lives at the top of the experiment, this is going to propagate downward into in this particular image, would propagate downward into the instrument. So being periodic, if we transform that into frequency space, we would see that the harmonics exist and have been shown to exist above 1 kilohertz. So that's something we're looking at dealing with. So now some of the effects of the noise. One of them I'll get into a little bit later in the talk is the resonances, internal resonances of the equipment. We're going to want to be able to make sure that that's not an issue. Another one is the triboelectric effect, or cable microphonics. In just a word or two, that's the motion of electrical cables. If it has the ability to affect sensitive electrical readings. Another one is, and the big one for me, is I mentioned a bit ago, which is tip sample separation issues. So like I said, a key metric is making sure that if you desire to run the squid on tip at a few nanometers up to about 20 nanometers away, you want to make sure that the tip stays around that number and isn't moving relative to the surface of a sample. That's important, especially in the cases where you have a magnetic field that decays rapidly from the surface of the sample that you're looking at. Great. Okay, so let's do a little bit of a detour and talk about the LC circuit and the current force analogy. So I'd like to talk about the Bode plot, which we're going to see quite a few times on my slides. The Bode plot is a great way to visualize if we have a simple circuit, in this case, what happens to the output signal compared to the input signal. So you can see that explained analytically with the transfer function. But first I'll talk about the Bode plot itself. So for example, if I plug in this situation, a 1 hertz signal, we're going to be at unity and we're going to get about a 1 hertz signal out. If we keep going along and I plug in about a 25 hertz signal, we're going to see this system start to resonate. So this is called a resonance, or a natural frequency of the system. And the reason it's called a filter is because, for example, if I plug in a 100 hertz signal, we're going to be at about minus 20 dB. So we see some attenuation of an incoming signal. If we do solve the transfer function analytically in this case, we'll end up with this expression here. And I want to find out, in this case, I've run a simulation. So I've just plotted that here. And I've chosen component values that if I plug those into the denominator when I solve for omega, the natural frequency, we'll get exactly about 25 hertz. So effectively, we're looking for where this fraction starts to blow up. Okay, so now with a little bit of the basics on the Bode plot, I want to run an experiment and take that fundamental as a building block, that circuit as a building block, and I want to stack a second and a third onto it. And so now we've got what's called a ladder filter, or a 3-cell filter. We're going to plot a Bode plot and observe some of the new features that are present in this Bode plot when we compare simple versions and more complex versions to one another. So the first thing you might notice is that the red curve, so this 3-cell filter is this red curve in the Bode plot. It looks like the attenuation increases, and that number is about 40 dB per decade per unit cell. The other thing that you'll notice is that the number of resonances increases per unit cell. So in the 3-cell filter, we actually have 3 resonances. You can see these 3 spikes here. That corresponds to the number of solutions that you get whenever you stack a filter in this way. All right, so that ends the detour of a little bit of scientific and technical background. I'd like to ask you to all change perspective a little bit. We're going to take our units, or our ladder filter, we're going to rotate it vertically. So now it looks like an actual ladder. At this point, hopefully we have a good idea of, if we put a signal in, what kind of signal we're going to get out using the Bode plot. I'd like to draw a new diagram. These squares are masses, and they're interrupted by springs. And I'd like to note the immediate geometrical similarity at the least. And I want to ask the question, if I plug in a force into the system, what kind of signal do we get out? And is there perhaps a mathematical relation between these two systems? In fact, there is, and we'll derive a little bit of it, which is called the current force analogy. So I'm going to save us the trouble of deriving all the currents in each one of these components and use Kirchhoff's law. And if we have 3 currents going into a node, we know they must be equal to the total going out. So I'm going to rewrite the currents that I solved for earlier and plug those into our current expression. I'm going to take the magnitude of the EMF and plug that in. So everywhere I see a V, I'm now writing d phi dt. That'll give me an integral of d phi when those dt's cancel. First derivative of phi and a second. If I rewrite that using dot notation, we can see time derivatives of phi. And then finally, the expression we care about most here is at the bottom. So I'm going to write another expression. This is the well-known and often used driven damped harmonic oscillator. And from these two written side by side, you can pretty much read off the mappings. So I've outlined them here on the next slide. Capacitance, mass, and inductance, 1 over the inductance to the springs, resistance and damping. And so this is an analogy that has helped me really build a good intuition for the modeling that we'll be doing in later slides. An immediate practical application of the technique is to take the natural frequency we solved for earlier in the LC circuit. If we write that as we're using our mappings, we'll get 1 over m over k, root m over k. If we rearrange that, we'll end up with the corresponding natural frequency of the simple harmonic oscillator. So, okay, so now we're going to get into the heart of my work, which is based around the hybrid cryostat and mechanical filter. We've started off with an electrical circuit, moved to mechanical, and this is now where we take a little bit of a change, and there's 2 ways that you can, or I guess so far I've looked at a couple different ways in which you can implement a filter into an experiment. So we had my advisor Dan and one of our group members Justin Griffith came up with a new idea of, instead of building a filter and then taking the filter and attaching it as an independent system to the experiment, what if instead you were to incorporate the mechanical filter directly into the experiment and use the experimental equipment as masses in your filter? And so they worked together, they brainstormed, and then eventually Justin built a full-scale 3D model of the new idea and the new integrated filter. And so you can see that exploded out here. I'll kind of put a name to a face on each one of these experimental components in the next slide, and talk a little bit also about COMSOL. Actually, I'm going to go back real quick and explain. If you were to take these outermost cylinders and stack them together, this is the model that you'd end up with. So this is the actual model that I'm working with in my work. So that leads me to COMSOL multiphysics. So this is kind of where all of my research takes place. And COMSOL multiphysics is a really powerful numerical and physical systems solver. So you can use it to model just about any geometrical or 3-dimensional object you like and apply any physics you would like to it and do experiments. And so Justin and Dan handed me this 3D model, and we decided to see how it would perform if we were to reconstruct the model inside of COMSOL multiphysics. So just a few names for these components. This is the outermost vacuum can. This brown cylinder is a heat shield. This is an inner vacuum can. And then also this pink cylinder here at the bottom, I'll refer to this quite a few times. This is the scanning head. So this is where the actual squid on tip lives. And the heart of the experiment is here. These red lines represent springs in the filter. And I'll refer to those also. So the thing that I needed to do to build this model inside COMSOL was to basically find out which pieces of the mechanical or of the new model correspond to which masses in my ladder filter. So for example, in our ladder filter that we've looked at in previous slides, the bottommost mass corresponds to the region of the scanning head. That's interrupted by these 3 springs here, K3, which connects to the next grouping in masses, so on and so forth. And you can imagine how this model is broken down into its different parts. So using COMSOL, since it's so powerful, it also is there's a lot of flexibility. And so one of the things I wanted to do was figure out what the constraints of my model were. One of the first things that's constrained is the geometry. So the volumes of the devices or the equipment and the operating lengths of the springs. So the model is drawn with operating lengths, or drawn at its operating length, meaning these springs are fully extended under gravity. From there, I was able to figure out exactly the lengths of each individual spring. The next thing I was able to do is to use COMSOL to figure out if we assign a material to a volume, For example, if I assign copper to this outermost vacuum can, I can use the density, the mass density, to back out the total mass of this object. And so, for example, mass 4, the scanning head using this technique gave me about 1.4 kilograms. Then with the masses and the displacements in hand, you're able to use Hooke's law to invert Hooke's law for the spring constant and find out the final constraint in our how we need to fully specify the ladder filter below. The trick here is that if you want to figure out how much weight or how much mass that spring K1 needs to support, you actually need to sum the masses below it. So in my formula, you'll see M2, M3, and M4 go into this. Finally, using and applying Hooke's law, we have our fully specified system. So those values are all here. So with those values in hand, the first thing that I did was plug them into my electrical system and run a simulation in a software called LT Spice. So this is an electrical system here. And LT Spice, I plotted a Bode plot. And the resonances that LT Spice predicts is these numbers here: 1.25 hertz, 2.45 hertz, and 2.82 hertz. Now I tested out my mechanical electrical correspondence, and COMSOL actually has a one-dimensional, 1 degree of freedom point mass modeling system called the lumped model. I used exactly the same parameter values and plotted that against COMSOL, I plotted that against my electrical filter. And we can see fairly good agreement at the resonances at this point in time, which is at first order a pretty good indicator we have that the current force analogy is working. The next stage was to learn COMSOL and plot what I think is an idealized model of the mechanical filter using these cubes here. So I can assign masses to the cubes. They're connected by springs, and so they are a simplified three-dimensional model. In this case, we now have new degrees of freedom, or more degrees of freedom, since it's a three-dimensional model. So I wanted to control for the possibility that introducing new degrees of freedom would immediately impact your Bode plot. But as you can see, we see great agreement with COMSOL's one-dimensional model in that the resonances are overlapping once again, and the attenuation looks comparable. Finally, I will now refer to this model as the COMSOL model for convenience. We finally got this, in my research, got this model working and plotted that against all the other prior models to see how it compares. And as you can see, immediately we see great agreement in the resonances, but there are some new features, which is why we wanted to give this a shot. First thing you'll note is the resonance down here, this 0.5 hertz. You'll also notice these little spikes and this dip here. COMSOL allows me to investigate these in detail. So the first small spike here corresponds to a resonance of a mass. Same thing with this one. This dip corresponds to damping that I applied in order to properly design the system. And we'll take a look at these, the ones I want to talk about, which is the resonances on the next slide. So COMSOL allows you to animate the eigenmodes of a system. And so I can actually animate the oscillations of what this 0.5 hertz resonance looks like, for example. So 0.5 hertz corresponds to, and I hope you can see this, I hope Zoom's allowing us to see this, but this looks like a pendulum-like motion or oscillation of the scanning head. So let's talk about the other resonances. This 1.25 hertz looks like an oscillation of primarily the vertical direction of some of the other components. The same is true of this 2.45 hertz resonance in the middle. And the same is also true of this 2.81 hertz at the end. So I ran an experiment inside COMSOL, noticing that the 2.45 hertz resonance and the 0.5 hertz resonance correspond to oscillations of primarily the scanning head region. I decided to apply damping to the spring that supports it to see what happens and to confirm that the plotting of these eigenmodes is actually correct. And so I just animated that in here. If you can see, it looks like applying damping to specifically that set of spring, or that spring, which would be K3, immediately attenuates or damps the resonances at those locations. Okay, so I mentioned on previous slides that one of the possibilities is actually exciting the resonances, internal resonances of the masses in the experiment or in the equipment. And so I plotted the Bode plot for the COMSOL model all the way out to about 10 kilohertz to see if we could find any new resonances. Indeed, there are. The Bode plot doesn't tell you what they are, however, so I decided to go ahead and use the animations to find out what they look like. And as you can see, the resonances, in particular 10,000 or around 10 kilohertz, corresponds to a displacement of the outermost vacuum can, the surface, relative to itself. So that looks like an internal resonance. So that's something we can track down. Okay, so I've mentioned damping now a few times, but I haven't actually talked about how I went about applying damping, and I'd like to do that here. So if we take the undriven harmonic oscillator and we solve the characteristics equation, we'll end up with an expression for critical damping. So this C here that looks like this. So C is equal to 2 root km. I'm going to call that critical damping. Now I'm going to set up a ratio between critical damping and applied damping. So this uppermost C is applied damping. I'm going to call it zeta. Doing it in this way, defining it as a ratio, allows me to talk about zeta, hopefully in a way that's a little bit more convenient and intuitive. For example, if I were to apply no damping, we'd have 0 at the top, and this zeta would be 0. If I were to apply perfect amount of damping or critical damping, this ratio would become 1. So we can talk about the effects of critical damping, and this I think is a good way to maybe look at what happens in the time domain. If I apply critical damping, we're going to be on this curve here, which this green curve here, I hope you can see, will correspond to reaching the steady state of the system, both quickly and smoothly. Other methods, like say, for example, applying 0.1 zeta, you'll oscillate around the steady state before eventually reaching attenuation. It still begs the question, however, my equations apply to a one-dimensional and single spring mass model. So how do we damp the ladder filter? It's a little bit more complicated. So I decided to treat it as a common technique in electrical systems, which is simplifying the circuit by grouping pieces together. So we can call this big M a grouping of M2, M3, and M4. And then I will damp that simple system. So here's my critical damping for this simplified system, K1, and you can see how I summed my masses. I repeated this process for C2 and C3 to get a unique number for each stage. Now I'm going to take my zeta and I'm going to damp the lumped model. So this is the 1D COMSOL model. What I did was it took the original, which predicted those resonances we saw earlier, and I applied different levels of zeta. So in this case, an eighth zeta, a quarter zeta, 0.5 zeta, and 1 zeta, or critical damping. And as you can see, in each iteration of zeta, we get closer and closer to a very smooth curve in frequency space. It doesn't necessarily answer whether or not this method will work in the COMSOL model, the full three-dimensional volumetric model. However, we can see that this it appears to be a good method as we apply similar iterations of zeta. We once again see a pretty smooth curve at critical damping. As an added note, if we zoom in on the critically damped model, the critically damped COMSOL model, you can see that the omega 3 dB point is around 0.85 hertz. Okay, so the next thing we did was decide to move our experiment to reality and compare against an actual mock-up of the filter that we've been simulating thus far. So Justin, another group member, built a 3D model of the mock-up filter, which is modular. It allows you to change the masses and springs at will. The first thing we did was one of our group members, Cameron Dotz, did some geophone measurements to compare the vibration levels at different locations on the mock-up filter. And just to move quickly, displacement in microns on the y-axis looks like it's the lowest in the bottommost stage of the filter. So we attach the geophone, for example, to the region of the scanning head represented here. However, you'll notice that this cuts off at about, I think this is about 5 hertz or so. If you want to capture the resonances of the mock-up filter, that's not quite low enough. So we decided to come up with a new system, which involves using accelerometers. So this is what's called an ADXL accelerometer and a microcontroller called a Teensy. So we worked really hard in the last couple weeks on getting this device to work together. Here's a little bit of a breakdown of the hookup. And we wrote a bunch of code, and eventually we got one of these units working, which is really exciting. So then we, with our single one working, we built a second one. And we attached one to the top of the mock-up and another to the bottom. Then we attached it to a computer where we could multiplex data from both the top and the bottom of the filter. The end goal being able to compare an input frequency or an input signal to an output. So then we took some data, and the first thing that I wanted to do is just to make sure that our ADXLs are calibrated correctly. So I put a Bluetooth speaker playing a 100 hertz sine wave at the top of the cryostat in the lab, and then took data for about 30 seconds, and then Fourier transformed it to see if the Fourier transform would capture that 100 hertz. It does. It also captures the harmonics, which is exciting. It means at first order, we've got a reasonably good method to collect and process data. So this stuff on this slide is pretty much brand new. So I'm still working quite a bit on the best methods of analyzing the data here. I've been working with a graduate student on the best method to interpret this graph at this point. But as far as I'd like to say at this point, with some degree of confidence, is that the ADXLs are performing as we hope they might, and picking up on some interesting features in our mock-up filter. So this red curve here, or I guess this red region, it's actually a single line. It just gets very highly resolved and turns into what looks to be an area. This corresponds to the bottom ADXL. So I'm going to reverse just a second. That means we're looking at this ADXL down here. As you can see, it looks like up above around 10 hertz. The filter is not or the bottommost ADXL is not picking up on the higher amplitude of response in the upper ADXL, so the top ADXL accelerometer upon comparison. So the next thing I want to do is zoom in onto this region, which is exciting. Now with our new instrument, we're able to look at a little bit higher resolution near about 1 hertz. The first thing I want to point out is the 1.4 here. This represents 1.4 hertz. So when we ran this data, or when we took this data, we turned on the pulse tube and took data for a period of 5 minutes to see how the ADXLs are performing under perturbation from the pulse tube directly. So we found the 1.4 hertz of the pulse tube. It also appears to have found some of the harmonics. So 4.2, 5.6, and 7 are actually whole number multiples of that 1.4 hertz. There also is some unique features of the bottom ADXL. You only see these spikes in the red curve, and they look suggestive, I'll say. The sensor values that those numbers are plotted or listed here below: 1.7 hertz, 1.07 hertz, 2.08 hertz, and 2.40 hertz. Now, if you recall from my simulated values, those values are 1.25 hertz, 2.45 hertz, and 2.82. So it's possible to say that although there's much more work that needs to be done to characterize our new instrument, that those could correspond to the resonances of the filter, which personally is very exciting, and I look forward to investigating more. So there are some open questions that I have in terms of my work and future work that's still available on this project. I'll just name a few of those possibilities. One of the first ones is I'd like to further characterize the ADXL so that I can make a one-to-one comparison between its performance in terms of displacement. Prior experiments at this point are only looking at acceleration, so we don't see the roll-off we expect. Producing the transfer function also requires comparing an input signal to an output signal, which we've not yet done. That turns out to be a harder problem than I had thought, but something that is definitely something I'd like to continue to investigate. Another one is damping the mechanical filter. We didn't get a chance to experiment with damping on the mock-up just yet, but I'd like to see what effect it has on the measurements from the ADXLs. The next thing, like I said, is to see if we can find the transfer function of the mock-up filter. Some other problems to consider is how the mock-up filter will perform under cold temperatures and also under vacuum. So those are definitely some things I'd like to continue to investigate. Okay, so that concludes my talk. At this point, I'd like to just say a word of thanks to everyone who's been involved. I think everyone in this room has helped me in numerous ways. So first off, thank you all. Thank you to my advisor, Dan, who has been encouraging, and thank you for your guidance, and thank you for this opportunity. It's been an incredible and exciting learning experience, even in a time of uncertainty with the changes with COVID. It's been incredible, though, so thank you. Thank you to my friends and family. Thank you all for joining me today, for the support. There's a couple group members I'd also like to thank, without whom this project would not be possible. So Aricha, thank you for answering my millions of questions with patience. It's, I wouldn't be able to do and understand anywhere near as much as I have without your help. Thank you to Cameron Dotz, who gave me a bunch of his time in a stressful time to help me complete the end of this project, or get closer to the end of this project. So he's not here, but a big thanks to him. Also Justin, who without his expertise in cryostat design and AutoCAD, this project would not be a possibility at all. Thank you to my advisor, Gretchen Lang, who's here today for your support and your encouragement in helping me maintain balance during the physics degree. And thank you to my family once again for joining me today, my partner, Aubrey, my brother, Michael, mom and dad. You guys, it's awesome to have you and to deliver this talk for you all. And finally, thank you to the University of CU Boulder, who's helped me, all the faculty and staff who've helped me start a new career in physics and a new life path. So without anything else to say, that concludes my talk. I really appreciate you all joining me.
All right, thank you.
Very nice.
I guess I better unmute